Welcome. We're just going to take a few seconds for everyone to join the webinar, and we'll begin in about a minute. Okay, I see a lot of participants coming in now, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. That's a good, nice number. Welcome. My name is Dr. Alexander Moffat. I am the director of the DWC program here at Providence College. I'm also associate professor of English, and I'd like to welcome you to today's talk in the Humanities Forum. And today's talk is titled "The Great Influenza Pandemics Then and Now." Just a few words about the Humanities Forum. Humanities Forum has many events every semester at Providence College. The next event we're going to have on November 12th. We're going to be talking with writer and critic Thomas Chatterton Williams. And the title of that talk is "On Unlearning Race and Open Debate." I believe that's a culminating event in the Humanities Forum for this year. So please join us for that event as well. I'd like to take a few moments to introduce our speaker. Today's speaker, who we're going to be having a conversation, is John M. Barry. He is the writer of this magnificent book, The Great Influenza. The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. It's the winner of the 2005 Keck Communications Award. This book is written in 2004. There's a very important afterword that was written in 2018 on the 100th anniversary of the 1918 Great Influenza pandemic. John Barry is also the author of Rising Tide, The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 and How It Changed America, as well as many other books and articles. Please join me in welcoming John Barry. One of the things we lose on Zoom is the applause, but it's out there. I promise you this wonderful round of applause for you, John. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. Just as a first thing, since this is homecoming week for us, and this event is part of the homecoming programming, I understand you've got some connections with Providence, and maybe even with
well, more than a connection. I'm from Providence. I was actually there last weekend to see family. Went to classical. Had many friends who went to PC. My father was actually an adjunct faculty at PC, and almost 50 years ago, I know I don't look that old, but almost 50 years ago, PC had a very, very, very good club football team, which was equal to a Division III college, regular football team. I coached on that team. Some of you may know Rich Kless, who's in the administration at PC, who played there on that team. He was a defensive back and a very good one. The team was good enough. They actually had NFL interest in 3 players, even though we were at that level. And our defense led the nation in fewest points or allowed 2 years in a row. So gave up 46 points one season, and the next season improved to 42 points for the entire season. That's pretty good. I then went on to coach football in the big time at actually Tulane. At that time, played very serious big time football. We were nationally ranked, beat an LSU team that was ranked number 5. In front of the largest football game ever to watch a game in the South at the time, about 87,000 people, which was about 20 times more than the total fans for 2 seasons who ever watched us play at PC. So.
Magnificent. I had no idea about the hidden history of football at Providence College. So I've already learned a lot from this.
Well, practically almost every team we played went on to start a Division III team, and I wish PC did the same, but whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I live down the street from Classical High School, so it's good to hear that you're a classical alum. That's magnificent. Yeah. So the way this format's going to work is I've got a few questions that I'm going to pose to John. We're going to just start a conversation, and hopefully you listening and looking on will also have questions. If you type them in the Q&A section, I will get to those questions at at some point in the conversation when it looks like there's a good amount of time remaining. And I'll try to offer up some audience questions as well, John. Reading Great Influenza here, something struck me over and over. I'm a English professor, and I'm sensitive to rhetoric and devices. One device you keep using over and over, and it just hit me. I thought it was really powerful. Is often in an ironic way, you would say, this was still influenza, only influenza. And we hear language like that today, only, not so ironic about COVID, don't we? That's just influenza. I just wonder how prevalent was that attitude back in 1918? Oh, it's just influenza. Bearing in mind, the descriptions that you provide about, what happens to some of the people who contracted.
Well, it was tied into the government's attitude, the federal government's attitude, but the motivation was very different from today. We were then at war, and Wilson's focus was 100% the war. Nothing was going to deflect him, or to the extent that he was capable of controlling it, nothing was going to deflect the attention of the country on the war. As a result, the government lied, but they created an infrastructure to boost the war effort, and Wilson justified it, I guess, to himself by, for two reasons. Number one, the largest demographic group in the United States was of German descent, and there were a lot of Irish Americans as well. So he wondered, or had some question, whether or not German Americans would fight Germany and Irish Americans would fight on the side of Britain, 1916, the Easter Uprising in Ireland. So he was very concerned about the attitude of the public, and created something called the Committee for Public Information, which was a propaganda arm. In fact, the architect of that committee said point blank, nothing in experience tells us that truth is superior to falsehood. All that matters is its impact. And at the same time, they passed a law making it punishable by 20 years in prison to, quote, utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government in the United States. Truth was not a defense. They vigorously prosecuted that law. They sent a congressman to jail for 10 years under that law. So that is a context in which influenza arrived. That was already existing. And again, there was a reason. They wanted to gin up patriotism. The Providence newspaper, every day, above the title, Providence, had said, any German American, unless known for years, must be regarded as a spy. The sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. To help morale, songs like I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now were banned from all military bases. So when the pandemic arrived, they thought that any negative news about anything was going to hurt morale and hurt the war effort. And the result was they lied. Now, the truth is, nobody in the public paid any attention to that after the first few days. Now we have a significant portion of the public believing that this pandemic is fairly trivial and being hyped by the press. That was not the case in 1918. The press, generally speaking, almost universally echoed the lines of the White House, but the public knew better. And the reason was that virus was much, much more virulent than this one. And it killed between 50 and 100 million people. If you adjust for population, that's 220 to 440 million people today. No projection, the worst case projection for COVID-19 is a fraction of that. In addition, people could die 24 hours after the first symptoms, and 2/3 of the dead were people aged 18 to 45 years old. The peak age for death was 28. So all those things combined meant that the public took it very seriously from the very beginning. And, you know, all that happened when the only result of their being lied to was they didn't believe anything they were being told, which did have significant impact.
Right, and it sounded like that may have changed sort of when the war finishes, and maybe some of that speech slang, not necessarily the case in the United States, but it sounds like the press was maybe more honest and forthright about it when the flu got to its sort of second and third, or into the third waves into 1919, 1920.
Well, that may have been true in 1919. You know, the second wave ended in most of the United States almost practically the day the war ended, November 11th. There was considerable simultaneity, and it's worth noting that the end of the war was very much a surprise to the public. It's not like they could see it coming. In fact, the United States was gearing up to send a couple of million more men to Europe and for a major spring offensive in 1919. So, you know, there was some rumors about the war ending, but again, it was not something that was expected or anticipated.
Yeah. I want to go back to this issue of, you know, telling the truth and the significance of that, and the way that the government, you know, lied in some ways and about the flu in 1918. I mean, your recent New York Times op-ed said this was the big lesson in some ways of this. We've got to tell the truth here. And I know in the book you were very critical of the Philadelphia, New York political machines at the time, and the way that they handle that, as well as of the Wilson administration. And, you know, do we see, I mean, there's nothing quite like those political machines, I suppose. That's a debatable point, but I wonder where have you seen sort of echoes of those same, if I can call them pathologies of government today, where we're anxious to sort of downplay this? I mean, is it to the degree of those on a local or national level? Is it to the degree that it was in 1918?
Well, both in a sense. At the national level, you know, Trump clearly knew that this was much more serious than he let on. I'm sure you're all familiar with what he told Bob Woodward on February 7th. And still, you know, now he's saying we're rounding the corner, and cases just hit 90,000 yesterday. So for his own self-interest, I think it's ironic because if Trump had handled this better, I think he would have a very good chance of being reelected. The only time his popularity, his approval rating cracked 50% was a few days after he said we're at war with the virus. People rally around a leader. If he had taken charge and done what should have been done, he would be in a vastly stronger position politically. Merkel in Europe's got a 77% approval rating. So we, you know, because I think he misunderstood what happens. He saw the economy and public health as antagonistic. I've written several op-eds for the Times. I'm not sure if you're referring to the same one, but in one of the op-eds, I said they're actually dance partners and public health takes the lead. I can give you all sorts of studies that prove that when people feel they're safe, they're going to go out and be active in the economy. And when they don't feel they're safe, whether there's a regulation or restriction or not, they're going to stay home and not be active. there are also localities where you see the same, you use the word pathology, I call it idiocy. I live in New Orleans, and the governor has exercised all sorts of emergency powers. At one point, New Orleans had the fastest growth rate in the world of cases. New Orleans right now, and the state of Louisiana is actually flat, unlike the rest of the country, which is going up. Yet there are a majority of Republicans in the state legislature in the House who signed a petition to cancel the governor's emergency powers. And I mean, I think, it's village idiots, frankly. You can see that, I'm repeating myself. There are numerous studies that demonstrate that when people feel they're safe, they will participate in the economy. There was one by the University of Chicago earlier this year, a very conservative economics department, that concluded only 7% of the decline in economic activity, and they looked at 2.5 million businesses. Only 7% of the decline was a result of regulation. The rest was the result of people's concerns. There was also a study by a member of the Federal Reserve Board and an MIT economist that looked at 1918 and found that the cities that were closed longer and had stricter regulations actually did better in the economic recovery than cities that were closed for a shorter period of time. So yes, there are clearly echoes of 1918 today.
It sounds from your book that Philadelphia in particular was, with its corrupt machine government in 1918, it was just singularly unequipped and sort of botched this on multiple levels.
They did. They weren't alone, but when you talk about a corrupt machine, it wasn't your common everyday corruption. Their mayor was indicted in the middle of the pandemic, not for sticking money in his pocket, but as an accessory to murder. So they were pretty serious about their corruption. And a couple of years later, that same machine elected somebody to the United States Senate. It was a Republican machine back then, oddly enough. And Republicans controlled the United States Senate, but refused to seat a member of their own party because of the level of corruption. I mean, imagine that. They wouldn't seat somebody elected by their own party. So they were in the pocket, essentially, of saloon owners, which was, remember back then, you didn't have TV, forget about the internet. You didn't have TV, you didn't have radio. A lot of people, probably most people, didn't have telephones in their home. So if you wanted any entertainment, it was outside the house. TV, saloons, theaters, and so forth, vaudeville shows. And they were very powerful in that machine and in every machine in every big city. They pressured, they were very reluctant to close down the city of Philadelphia. And the result was that Philadelphia was the fourth or fifth hardest hit city in the United States in terms of death toll. Interestingly, Providence had one of the leaders nationally in public health, and I am embarrassed to say I can't think of his name offhand, but he was very much a national figure in public health. I should have checked that just before I came on, but I neglected to.
Of course. I have a question about, I'm a professor, of course, and I teach modern literature, so early 20th century. And, it's always struck me as odd. I mean, I'm going back a few years now, about how little the pandemic of 1918 has kind of affected it was remembered really in our contemporary discourse. I know you give the example, for instance, of literature, and there weren't many examples in American literature of people actually sort of talking about what happened. And you also talked about, of course, the censorship of information about the pandemic. And I'm wondering, is there a relationship there? Has that initial sort of 1918 censorship, or maybe the way that it was talked about after the pandemic finished, has that affected, I guess my question is two parts. Has that affected any kind of historical amnesia for us? And has that been changing since you've written this book? Have you seen sort of more ways in which, obviously it's very much on our minds in 2020, but I don't think it necessarily was even 2 years ago. Perhaps I'm wrong. I'm very wrong about that, though. Perhaps that's just my
Well, I mean, the fact is, I think my book has had some impact on that. I know it generated several works of fiction because the people who wrote the novels contacted me and said, having read my book, they were inspired to write a novel about it. My book was a bestseller. There's still, the vast majority of the public, of course, never heard of it. In terms of, so that covers modern time, or I mean, today. In addition, we've been a lot more concerned about pandemics in the last 15 years or so. Coincidentally, my book came out right at the time when so-called bird flu was in the news. Then and same time we have SARS, we have, Zika, HIV. People have been paying more attention to pandemics, and the natural place to look is 1918 if you're thinking about a pandemic, whether you're writing fiction or doing historical research. In terms of at the time, and we were discussing this a little bit before this webinar started. Yeah, there was very, very little fiction written about it, much less than you might expect. John Dos Passos is one of my favorite writers. He got sick, almost died. In his entire body of work, there are about 2 sentences. There are a couple of things, Catherine Ann Porter, William Maxwell, but that's really about it. There was a lot of pulp fiction written about this shortly after it. And I actually didn't know that when I was writing the book, but since it can, in fact, somebody in another webinar in a position much like yourself told me they happened to have studied all that stuff, and there was quite a bit of pulp fiction about it. By the same token, it lasted in people's memories. When I started writing this book, my aunt was still around, and as soon as I mentioned it to her, she grabbed her check and said, "Oh my God, that's the only time I saw my father cry." This is my grandfather. That's because across the street, a couple, both of them died, leaving 3 or 4 orphans, which was actually not that unusual. So I said 2/3 of the dead were people aged 18 to 45. And oddly enough, I was looking at this very question earlier today, because I was thinking about writing something else in an op-ed, and people were asking about this. So let me read to you a couple of things from the book. Okay, so in 1919, Robert Frost, who had influenza, writes, "What bones are they that rub together so unpleasantly in the middle of you in extreme emaciation? Here it is as late as this," and this is, like 8 months after he's gotten sick. "And I don't know whether or not I'm strong enough to write a letter yet." And that's months after he was sick.
Yeah.
John Dewey, writes in the New Republic, quote, "It may be doubted if the consciousness of sickness was ever so widespread as it is today. The interest in cures and salvations is evidence of how sick the world is." That's in 1923. In 1933, Christopher Isherwood writes the book Berlin Stories. And if you haven't seen the movie Cabaret, I highly recommend it. It's easily, I think, one of the 10 best movies ever made. It's derived from Berlin Stories. At any rate, when the Nazis enter Berlin, Isherwood writes, "You could feel it like influenza in the bones." So he expected 15 years after the pandemic that everybody who read what he was writing would know exactly what he meant. This combination of dread, a deep dread and an ache. So the people who lived through it, it was, I think, very much in their consciousness. And it stayed in their consciousness. And yet, very little was written about it. I've never been able to explain that adequately. I will say that I remember mentioning this to a friend of mine who happened to be a scholar of the Middle Ages, and he told me, and I quoted him in the book too. See if I can find it. It's not in here, somewhere else. But he said it was funny that there were some very, very well-known, horrifying pieces written about the bubonic plague, but that actually the most striking thing was how little was written about the plague. We don't realize that because these few pieces are so powerful and so well known. But he said actually very, very, very little was written about it. So, I don't know if it's common. In terms of scholarship, there may be a better explanation, or at least a hypothesis. And until relatively recently, perhaps, maybe in the late 70s or so, when environmental history became a field, historians tended to write about what people did to people and not what nature did to people. So that might explain the relative lack of scholarship on the disease.
Yeah, it might be. And of course, so many writers in the 20s would write about the war, whether they had been there or not, and the legacy of the war. And I wonder, your Isherwood comment leads me to suspect that maybe on sort of the level of metaphor, on the level of just little references here and there might be more there than we think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I didn't make a systematic search of the literature. That's not what I was writing about or researching.
Yeah, I want to go to the Q&A after my next question in just a second. So if you're thinking of questions, please go ahead and type them in. I'll get them in order. I just have a quick, and this is your, one thing we often talk about is how will COVID change everything? There's a lot of talk saying, will we ever go back to normal, whatever that is? What is going to change permanently as a result of the pandemic? I was wondering what your take on this question is, John. If what can the 1918 pandemic tell us about that idea of going back to normal, and what do you think might be some permanent changes?
There are a lot of ways in which 1918 offers a lot of lessons and a lot of precedents. That is not one of them. And the reason is that influenza, one of the biggest differences, the two biggest differences between the viruses is, number one, lethality. 1918 was much, much more virulent. Nobody thought it was a hoax. I mean, some of the symptoms were horrific. You could bleed not only from your nose and mouth, but from your eyes and ears. That kind of gets your attention. So the virulence is one, but the other is the duration. Influenza moves much faster than COVID-19. The incubation period's 1/3 as long. you're sick for a much shorter time, you shed virus for a much shorter time. So influenza moved through roughly 2/3 of the deaths over a 2-year period were compressed into about 14 or 15 weeks in the fall of 1918. In a particular city, it was less than that. The disease would strike the city, and then little as 6 weeks later, it would be gone. And rarely would it hang around more than 10 weeks. So with that short a duration, it didn't really have a lasting impact on society. COVID-19 has already been with us longer than the second and third waves of the 1918-1919 virus. And those are the ones that matter. The first wave was the virus. There's another difference is the influenza virus mutates rapidly. This virus does not. There was a hit or miss first wave in 1918, which was actually very mild, and then the virus changed, became more virulent and much more lethal. So the length of time that you have to put up with something, matters. You can forget about it much more easily when it's short. So in terms of public health measures, they were identical in 1918 to what we're doing now. And in fact, what we're doing now, I was involved in the conceptualizing of the preparedness plan for the Bush administration, and I talked to people in the White House and the Obama White House all the time during the 2009 pandemic. The public health recommendations are derived from the Bush preparedness plan. As I said, I participated in them, and because we studied what happened in 1918 and what worked in 1918. As we go forward with this, if we're wearing masks and socially distancing a year from now, which is very possible, I think habits will change. If miraculously, or almost miraculously, the vaccines are 85% or 90% effective, and they get distributed by late spring next year, I think people have remarkably short memories, and we'll go back to the pre-pandemic normal in terms of socializing. Obviously, working at home and things like that, they are probably permanent changes. Retail sales, those are probably permanent changes. The pandemic will have, I think, accelerated trends that already existed. So those things will probably stay different. The impact of that on office space, dispersion of populations, architecture. One of the most important things and least recognized for its importance and in preserving your health is ventilation.
Yeah.
And yet, all these modern windows, you can't open buildings, you can't open the damn window. And that ventilation would be enormously helpful. I think in future, maybe windows you can open them.
I think that in hotel rooms, you often can't open the window. And
yeah. How many times the air turns around in the room is very important. Whether they HVAC and UV lights and all sorts of things they can do to make that safer, but is something as simple as opening the damn window is enormously important. So there will be some changes, and how much, I think, depends on the efficacy and timing of the vaccine and therapeutic drugs. Most people, if you look back to March, there were expectations that we would have some therapeutic drugs much sooner than we would have vaccines. But we don't have any drugs yet, and we're on the verge of having vaccine approvals. You know, there were several antivirals, quite a few of them actually, that were being tested that we thought would work. They work in a petri dish. They don't work in people, including remdesivir, which we really did think did some good, at least, maybe not a tremendous amount, but some good. But now the World Health Organization, a week or so ago, looked at studies from multiple countries, 100 hospitals, and concluded it's not any good. So we, you know, the monoclonal antibodies are not online yet. But again, if the drugs come online, if the vaccines come online, and people's memories are short, and we'll go back to shaking hands and hugging when we meet. I think everybody wants human touch. But if it's extended longer, then, you know, handshaking will probably disappear.
I mean, I think of the social interactions where I've really gotten used to staying 6 feet away from people. And now when someone gets close to me, I mean, it seems very quick to me over a couple of months how now I sort of jump back almost sort of intuitively. I hope I'm not being rude to people, but I wonder how hard that will be for me to break and for others to break too. Yeah.
Well, you know, that's distancing is the most important thing you can do to stay safe. You know, masks are probably second. I think masks matter. I was one of those back in March saying, not recommending masks for the public based on, there were actual studies in 1918. In fact, in 1917, they knew if you put a mask from some they were great scientists in back then. They didn't know what we know, but they were tremendous scientists. The Nobel Prize isn't given out until they know you're right. There's one guy in the book who won the Nobel Prize in 1966 for work he did in 1911. He was 55 years ahead of the curve. Anyway, you know, they knew that putting a mask on somebody sick worked. And there were a lot of studies after the pandemic about mask usage in the general public, and they concluded that they were not useful for the general public for a variety of reasons. And based on that, I was one of those saying early in this pandemic, no masks for the general public. I reversed myself, as everybody in public health has, because we learned more about transmission of this disease. In influenza, there is not any asymptomatic transmission. There is some pre-symptomatic transmission, but it lasts for at most 1 day. In this disease, you have significant, we don't know the exact number, but we know it's a very major factor of transmission by people who have no symptoms whatsoever, but are still shedding virus. And there's also pre-symptomatic transmission that lasts for 2 days. That's why people reverse themselves on masks. The data changed, so they change their minds.
Yeah. This is great. I want to bring in some of our comments and questions that are coming in our Q&A now, John. And so audience, if you have more questions, start typing them. I will get to them in turn. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Mark Brady, who says he was on the Friars foot team 76 to 80 and co-captain of the 1980 team.
Okay.
So, thanks for joining us.
I hope you had as good a record as we did.
Excellent. I've got a great question here from Dr. Patrick Green of the history department here. He wants to know about how schools handled influenza in 1918 and what the lessons are for today, especially given the differences between how the two diseases threatened the youth.
Well, almost every city in the United States closes schools, some sooner than others. You know, that's one issue, that the two viruses are different. You know, in influenza, number one, you know, kids are vulnerable. And in 1918, young kids were particularly vulnerable to the disease. In fact, children age 5 to 9 died at a rate that would equal all-cause mortality today for a period of 14 years, compressed into a few weeks. So all causes, cancer, car accidents, drownings, disease, for 14 years, compressed into a period of a few weeks. So number one, kids are vulnerable. Number two, in influenza, they are super spreaders. We know that. In COVID-19, they may or may not spread like everybody else, but they are not super spreaders. That's number one. And number two, they are not particularly vulnerable to the disease. They're not as vulnerable as older people. So in this disease, unless community transmission is very high, I believe schools should be open. The plans to close schools in a pandemic are all based on influenza, whereas I just said, kids are super spreaders and they're vulnerable. So it makes perfect sense to close it in an influenza pandemic, but the situation is different here. So I am sort of a hawk on keeping schools open. I think there's a lot of recent data that has come out in the last few weeks. There have been studies in Europe and elsewhere that have confirmed that schools are not major sources of spread. And okay, well, I answered that, so we can do another one.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I've got a question here from Celia Devine, who's interested in hearing what you have to say about the suppression of dissident ideas now going. She writes, so far as she can see, the suppression of dissident ideas now going on is of people who argue that the dangers of COVID have been hyped, or that masks do not work, or at what point the costs, what are the costs of our precautions? And she asks, how does this fit in with the lies told during World War I? That is there any kind of parallel here between the suppression of those ideas and the suppression of talking about the influenza back then?
I don't think so. I don't think you can compare the two. In one case, you've got an argument today, and in 1918, you were put in jail when a Wisconsin newspaper was printing the truth about the disease. The Army started prosecution proceedings to send the editor and the publisher to jail for telling the truth. Facts out, just facts. And I mean, as the pandemic proceeded, that prosecution was dropped, but that was the approach. Today, I wouldn't say that it's at all suppressed that people argue for herd immunity. I mean, I think that is a terrible policy to follow. I wrote an op-ed in the Times as to why. I could go into it here if you want me to. But in terms of suppression, no. I mean, the Great Barrington Declaration has gotten a tremendous amount of attention. There are people writing in favor of that all the time. The fact is, that is a tiny minority of public health experts, tiny, who feel that way. And some of those who feel that way really don't have any background in public health, like Atlas in the White House. So if you have anything like a representative selection from experts, it's going to be overwhelmingly against those ideas. But certainly any public figure, any political figure who advances that, they get full attention. So I don't think you can say it's suppressed. I think it's when somebody says something like that, there is very often a rebuttal, but that's not suppression.
I can ask a follow-up question here from Raymond, who this is relevant to what you were just talking about. He asked, "What do you think of Sweden's strategy, and do you think it would have been or could be going forward instructive for us?"
Yeah, Sweden has been often looked to as what we should have been doing. That's what the herd immunity advocates say. I think Sweden proves the reverse. For those of you who don't know, Sweden never closed schools for anybody under age 16. They kept practically all their businesses open. And their idea was to protect the elderly. That is exactly the Great Barrington Declaration. You know, what they call focused protection on the vulnerable. So what are the results? First, Sweden's death toll per capita was more than 5 times Denmark and more than 11 times Norway. So the protection wasn't so good for the vulnerable. Second, their economy actually performed worse than Denmark and worse than Norway in the second quarter. I think that goes back to a point I made earlier, that it's clear that economic activity is determined by, I think I made it earlier today, that it's, really determined when people feel safe, and then they are active. And in addition, if you look at the case counts right now, Sweden's case numbers are also going straight up a little bit, not quite as bad as the rest of Europe, but they're pretty bad. I looked last week, and it would have been, I don't know what they are, in the last couple of days. I looked, I guess, earlier this week, and it was about 40,000, the equivalent of 40,000 cases a day for the United States, which is obviously better than we're doing. We just hit 90,000, but it's a long way from what you, and it was also still going looking like this. So I don't know where they are now. So the idea of herd immunity did not take if there is herd immunity. So I consider Sweden a dismal failure and a pretty good example of why we should not follow that path.
I've got a great question coming in from Donald Kilgus Jr. and he points out something quite interesting that I didn't, I knew, but I hadn't quite put together in my mind, which is that both President Wilson and President Trump were infected by their respective pandemic.
Right.
And he asked, how would you compare the president's / government's reaction to each of those situations?
Well, Wilson was infected at Versailles during the peace conference, and it had a dramatic impact on world history, I believe. One of the most common complications in 1918 was neurological. And COVID-19 also, and this is another reason why I think herd immunity is a terrible idea, is that this virus, like the 1918 virus, infects almost every organ. We know that people who have no symptoms whatsoever still suffer heart damage. There was one study that found 78% of people, including those who had no symptoms of any kind, showed heart damage on scans. A lot of people have lung damage, including those who have no symptoms whatsoever. We have no idea whether or not that damage will heal or whether that will lead to, a heart attack at age 30 or 40, when that person would otherwise be healthy until they're 80. So if you are knowing, and other viruses, including influenza, also infect other organs sometimes. The 1918 virus certainly did. But why would you knowingly expose several 100 million people to this risk that you really don't know how serious it's going to be? I think it's crazy, but that's an aside from the question. Wilson's mind was clearly affected. Everybody around Wilson, from the White House usher to Herbert Hoover, to the Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. Everybody who dealt with Wilson said he was never the same. He couldn't function. His mind went, it just was awry. Before he got sick, he was insistent upon every one of the 14 points that he said the US was going to war over, which in short the slogan was make the world safe for democracy. It was anti-imperialistic. He wanted all the empires of the European countries to be freed from European dominance, advance democracy around the world, the League of Nations, and so forth and so on. He had actually ordered the passenger liner that brought him and the rest of the delegation to Versailles. He had ordered that ready for sail back to the United States because he wasn't getting his way. So he gets sick, quite sick, and he insists on restarting the negotiations while he's sick. And the British and French prime ministers actually came to his sickbed to negotiate because he was not well enough to get out. And he gave in on every one of the principles that he said we had gone to war over. Now, you can't prove that he gave in because he got sick. You can only say that he got sick and he gave in. However, anybody who knows anything about Woodrow Wilson's personal history would know that Woodrow Wilson was not the kind of person to compromise. Quite the reverse. He would rather blow everything up than compromise. And at the end of, John Maynard Keynes, after this, called him the greatest fraud on earth. And actually, I got the book here, and let me, there are a lot of, I want to read something. Should be able to find it, got the index. He had a lot of aides, two of whom went on to be Secretary of State, who were very upset over his giving in. And met to decide what to do, whether they were going to resign en masse or not. So several of them did resign. Not all of them did. But, these people included Lincoln Steffens, a very, very prominent writer, Walter Lippmann, who was probably the most powerful columnist of the 20th century, Samuel Eliot Morrison. But one of these people who later became an assistant secretary of state did resign. He wrote Wilson a letter. I'm going to quote from his letter. I am sorry that you did not fight our fight to the finish, and that you had so little faith in the millions of men like myself in every nation who had faith in you. Our government has consented now to deliver the suffering peoples of the world to new oppressions, subjections, and dismemberments, a new century of war. Mm. So, I think, and again, I can't prove it, that his inability to function mentally during those negotiations, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, commented on his complete collapse. That was a word Lloyd George used. Was a major factor in his yielding on all those points. And that letter by Bullard was unfortunately too prescient in terms of what would happen because of that peace conference. Wilson himself said if he was a German, he wasn't sure he would sign it.
Yeah, and Bullard's letter and also Keynes's comment before that, they're very pointed comments. John Maynard Keynes talking about a betrayal. Was it, so I'm guessing then that people didn't widely credit the influenza as affecting it. they saw it maybe as something about Wilson's personal character, or maybe he should have fought harder against
Well,
the
for one
influenza.
thing, they kept secret that he had influenza.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah.
So, indeed, I'm not the first person to actually find out what the actual symptoms were. To my knowledge, I was the second. There was a very good book written by someone named Alfred Crosby that was first published in 1976 about the pandemic. A very good book. And he went into detail about that. And I also looked at the notes of the doctor. I mean, he had influenza, but it got in the public perception and in the historical literature that he had suffered a minor stroke, and that accounted for it. But it wasn't a stroke, it was influenza. And anyway, so we were talking about comparing Wilson and Trump. There are neurological impacts of this virus, but Trump was treated with monoclonal antibodies. There is two, Eli Lilly and Regeneron, two companies that are leading the development of that. Both of them have found that they are not useful and administer them once somebody's pretty sick, but they seem to be very useful before you get really sick. Part of that reason is because once you get really sick, a lot of the problem is the immune system overreacting, the so-called cytokine storm. It's not the virus itself, it's your immune system attacking the virus. But until then, when the virus itself is the issue, then those antibodies are useful. And he was lucky. Trump got that treatment, and it served him very well, apparently. Who knows how sick he might have gotten, but he said on the Rush Limbaugh, he told Rush Limbaugh that it was touch and go, that he was quite seriously or potentially seriously ill. He doesn't release the medical records. So
you might find out more about that in the future. Who knows? Yeah. Philip Dewar writes with a question about one of the most vivid sections of the book and he asked if you can speak about the outbreak of Camp Devens in Massachusetts, because that section, that chapter of your book where you describe that and the effect and the virulence of the influenza there. I mean, it was just, it was very shocking to read about.
Okay, well, I'll go to the index and read this is powerful. This is a letter written by a doctor treating soldiers at Camp Devens, which is now closed, but people in New England probably know Devens is about 30 miles outside Boston. So he writes, these men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of La Grippe or influenza. But when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones. And a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis. Cyanosis is when you start to turn blue from lack of oxygen. You can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes. It is horrible. One could stand it to see 1, 2, or 20 men die. But to see these poor devils dropping like flies, we've been averaging about 100 deaths per day. Pneumonia means in about all cases death. We've lost an outrageous number of nurses and doctors. It takes special trains to carry away the dead. For several days, there were no coffins, and the bodies piled up something fierce. It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle. Goodbye, old pal. God be with you till we meet again. So that was what it was like in pretty much every military training camp in the United States during the pandemic.
Yeah. So it's 5:30 now. We have a couple more questions, John. If you're, I'm enjoying this conversation. So if you want to, let's just keep going for a few minutes more, if we can. Terry writes to say, first of all, the book is awesome, which I completely agree with. And she has a question. She says, recently we've been told that there isn't any correlation between students being in school and the spread of the disease. Is there any breakdown of the spread in communities where COVID precautions are taken in school versus communities where no COVID precautions are taken?
Yeah, I didn't quite hear the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there any breakdown of the spread in communities where COVID precautions are taken in school versus communities where no COVID precautions are taken in school? Wondering about the difference between COVID spread.
Yeah, I don't know of any data on that. I know data in terms of age groups, percentage of the total cases for different age groups, but that's different. That doesn't tell you what's happening inside the schools and the impact on transmission. I would hope that every school that is open is taking precautions, but I don't have any data on that.
Yeah.
I don't know. In Rhode Island, are they the schools open? Yeah.
They've in a very sort of limited way. Most students are remote. Some limited in-person instruction, with precautions being taken. And my son's in middle school, and he was in person, but one of his teachers got COVID, and they've gone to remote. So there's a lot of this kind of stop and start depending upon what's happening at the school. Yeah.
Okay.
John Scanlon writes with a New Orleans question for you. He says, as you said, the COVID situation in New Orleans isn't exactly in line with that of other big cities, at least in some ways. And he's asking about New Orleans and the influenza of 1918. What was the situation there in 1918, and how did it line up in relation to other cities or the country as a whole?
Well, it was pretty typical of one of the harder hit cities. There was, it's probably one of the 10 hardest hit cities in the country. The cities that got hit early tended to be hit worse. Is kind of one of the interesting things about the 1918 virus, which I've tried to, a couple of times I've written scientific journal articles with friends at National Institutes of Health and so forth, who help but translate my data into statistical significance and stuff like that. And one of the things that I've always tried to interest them in investigating unsuccessfully is that the later in the disease you got hit, the better off you were, generally speaking. This was true in any particular city. Let's say, as I said earlier, it takes 6 to 10 weeks to go through a city. If you got hurt in the first week, you tended to be more likely to die than if you got hit in the 4th week. This was true, and it was noted by some pretty careful epidemiological studies at the time. There was one in Connecticut that said the same thing. Obviously a small state, and yet as it dispersed geographically through the state, the later it was, the less likely to die. Quite curious. New Orleans was hit pretty early, a major port. Boston was the first place in the US to get hit by the lethal second wave. But New Orleans followed pretty closely. So it was not a good place to be. And I don't really have an explanation or even I have a hypothesis, but no proof as to why duration made a difference. You would think that maybe medical care improved, but that couldn't be the explanation, because medical care would have gotten worse, because people would have gotten, number one, there was nothing they could do for you anyway, except keep you hydrated. And number two, they got more and more exhausted, and doctors and nurses were dead. So later in the pandemic, you probably got less attention. So the only hypothesis I have, but I can't prove it, and you don't know if it's statistically significant in terms of what I observed, but that would be that the virus was mutating and becoming more mild. And it was doing the same thing all the way everywhere in the world, or about the same time. Virologists don't like that explanation, frankly. But I haven't really sat down with, I have friends who are virologists. I've never really sat down and discussed that in any detail with them.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're at about 5:36 right now. And so this seems like a good time to wrap things up. I'll just conclude by saying a couple of things. First of all, if you have not read Great Influenza, please do so. It's a wonderful book that will not only tell you about the circumstances of 1918 to 1920, but also give you a perspective on what's happening today. And I'd like to conclude by saying thank you very much, John Barry, for joining us. We really appreciate that. This was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
It's good to be back in Providence, sort of.
Sort of. It's snowing here, so sort of is
Okay.
probably
Is the Newport Creamery still open on Smith Street?
It certainly is. I've eaten
That's
there.
the last Newport Cream. When I was a kid, there were Newport Creameries Friendlies tried to steal their awful idea from them. Now
Yeah,
there
I
are
don't go to
Friendlies all over
Friendlies.
the place, but only one Newport Creamery in the state.
Yeah, I'm not from Rhode Island, but I'm loyal to Newport Creamery as well. And there are a few around still. So yeah, still on Smith Street. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.